Thank you so much for joining Sharebird's The Essential Go-to-Market Show, tips and strategies, where we offer short video content and interview-style conversations with global product marketing leaders. I'm your host, Yasmin Tarehi. Now, whether you're an early-stage startup or a public company, almost everyone struggles with the same question. What does it take to have a successful product launch? Today, I'll be talking to Robert McGrath. He's the head of product marketing, EMEA and LATAM of LinkedIn Talent Solutions. At LinkedIn, Robert leads the product marketing function for LinkedIn's largest business line, Talent Solutions, which incorporates hiring, learning, and engagement solutions. So we'll be talking about that on the show. So Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Yasmin, thank you for having me.
So Robert, just to kick it off, can you tell us from a go-to-market perspective, what are some of your top takeaways and learnings that you've seen over your tenure?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's such a great question, but an important one when I kind of look back at some of the learnings and areas of like that from the go-to-markets that I've brought. The key one originates around communication. If you can't effectively communicate to your internal audience, let alone your external audience, so your paying customers, it becomes extremely difficult to really understand what it is you're trying to achieve and what it is you're trying to bring to your individual markets and individual customers. So definitely how you communicate when and to who is vitally important as to how we think about success to go to market. Other areas actually originate around your stakeholder management, connected to communication to a degree, but really identifying who your stakeholders are internally. Who are the people that are the decision makers? Who are the people that are the influencers? Who are the people that's going to input into your plan to make it more effective? Because as a product marketer, you have a purview of the actual organization that you're working in. But on the other side, other stakeholders have an even deeper understanding. So really understanding their point of view is vitally important to how we bring those products to market. And the third is really the basic. You need to know what you're doing. You need to know what your priorities are. You need to know the objectives you're trying to solve for and build a meaningful plan around that in a communicative and a stakeholder engagement and a relationship building point of view, so that ultimately you will achieve those objectives and you will hit those KPIs.
Yeah, those are really great points. I think, a lot of people kind of misunderstand how important it is to get that internal alignment and to work with different cross-functional stakeholders and to also like understand the priorities. Because I think that's the key, right? Like a lot of people will have a laundry list of things that need to get done, but then they don't actually know where they should be spending their time. So prioritization is everything. So yeah, thank you for that. So, Robert, I want to talk a little bit about team structure and how you work best with certain teams from a go-to-market perspective. How are you guys actually creating your own team at LinkedIn? And maybe you could speak to that or speak to some other examples in your career.
Sure. I actually think the key to building a successful go-to-market team is a really clear understanding of roles and responsibilities. And coming back to the earlier question of your stakeholders, identifying them both inside and outside of your team. But how we kind of work it and how I've worked it in the past is that you have a regional focused go-to-market team, which is ultimately driving enablement, customer success, and sales readiness within a regional perspective. But then you work closely with the global go-to-market team, which is overall looking at the global scale and leverage approaches to go to market, as opposed to the regional, which would be very nuanced and very localized. So when we're setting up teams like this, we kind of use a triad model, which is product marketing, sales readiness, and our global sales organizations, so that we're actually having a really clear understanding about what it is we're selling, why we're selling it, and then ultimately how we're going to drive that through our sales channels to be successful. So when we're setting up, that triad is key in a regional setting, and then building out from that in terms of how we're going to message internally and externally. So what does that value prop look like? What does that value prop look like in non-English or localized markets? And how do we effectively sell that value prop and through our research and quantitative research to be able to bring that to market? So when we're thinking about that, it's the extended go-to-market team is as important as the strategic triad team, which is ultimately defining the go-to-market strategy.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't had a lot of people on the show who sit in a different market and also work with so many different languages and
Mm.
cultures. So I just think like go to market and communicating internally is challenging enough. And so I'm just really, I would say like kind of bewildered by how it's done in another market for so many other countries and languages. So how do you kind of deal with miscommunication or maybe cultural differences? Are there kind of go to market owners in each market within EMEA and LATAM? How does that work?
First of all, understand the concept and the impact of the product or solution that you're bringing to market and how relevant it is, because not all solutions can be sold in every market. So this comes back to your MVP and your piloting process, whereby you're understanding the product market fit relevant to your audiences. In our case, in an EMEA LATAM world, it's understanding what is our top growth countries and how does this product or solution fit in terms of driving monetization and growth within those markets. So that's a kind of like step one, is like understanding where it fits. Step two is using that insights to be able to build your messaging and your positioning relevant for that audience. Because to understand your pilot and your charter or your beta in other organizations, you're actually understanding if this will work. And if it does work, you've gone through a number of different A/B testing, which is ultimately bringing relevance to your messaging. So that's kind of like step two, using that research to the betterment of it. In terms of the activation, what we tactically go about is develop a sales activation strategy, which incorporates some sales sponsors and sales champions in offices, especially when you have a headquarter office and an even number of satellite offices around the region. And this is the key to, you're not physically there in person, so therefore it's difficult for you to gauge a pulse and understanding about how the sales enablement and activation methods are resonating in those particular markets. So these people, these identified people, allow us to get a pulse and an understanding, and then ultimately define our localized strategy as it starts to roll out. And that's the real key. And those sales champions have really unlocked opportunities that we may not have seen before, because they're able to get to the ground of that the field sales team have and understand ultimately how it's landing with our customers and with our teams locally.
Got it. Yeah, I've always been very curious about how that works.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I love that you said that you want to assign like a sales owner to each kind of go-to-market launch. Because I think that's a point that a lot of companies miss, right? Like we create a product launch and then there's no kind of metrics or KPIs or even an owner who takes responsibility for the success of that launch. So oftentimes people are very confused, like whose fault is this if that this didn't work out? And yeah, so I think that that's spot on.
One, just to add to that point as well, it's an underrepresented channel of effectively bringing to market a product. And that's the field sales teams that are on the ground, not only educating and driving them, it's also about what they're hearing and what they're doing, because that should help you to dictate your strategies going forward. So I totally agree with you. It's an underrepresented channel of activation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Robert, I want to jump to some of the biggest challenges or maybe mistakes that you have seen or done in the go-to-market process. And I also think maybe it's important to highlight this last year, right? Where I don't know if you transitioned to being remote and were in the office, but I think a lot of people now from a product marketing hat are struggling with managing this go-to-market process with a totally remote team. And communication is already so difficult from a cross-functional stakeholder perspective. So yeah, like, so what are some challenges that you face and like, what do you think is going to happen going forward with, I think a lot of companies are choosing to like stay remote. So yeah, are you like, is that more emotional bandwidth for you or how are you managing that?
It's a great question. And I think a lot of it is dependent on the individual. But if I think back about like focus of go to market, one of the values of being face to face is really understanding the conversation between one meeting room and the other, or the water cooler, because these opportunities allow you to get an unvarnished point of view about the product or solution that's potentially going to market, or the challenges that exist within that. That is very difficult to replicate in a virtual setting. And it's probably next to impossible. But what we've tried to do in some cases is create those type of environments as a kind of office hours or check-ins, whereby you're having more informal conversations pertinent to the activity that you're doing, but it's not as structured as potentially a virtual meeting can happen. Because as we've seen the transition between face-to-face in the normal world to the virtual, I don't know about you, but a lot of the meetings that I have, they all come with an agenda, because that back and forth small talk conversation that allows you to dig into various different topics that may not be even thought of going into the session, but have rich insights to help you. Having that kind of environment and creating that environment virtually is difficult. So these kind of office hours allow for that unstructured conversation to happen. The second, the kind of other area, like certainly for me, is how we use technology and how we drive, like LinkedIn is owned by Microsoft. So we have a lot of Microsoft Office Suite products. So like the Teams is a huge channel for which we can stay in touch, have conversations, give updates. Conventionally, email is not as strong as it once was, judging by the development of Teams and how we kind of interact internally. So from that perspective, I think it's easier to stay in touch, but it's more complicated to have a relationship. And I think that's the two differences that sometimes you'll never replicate, but in others you can do some simple kind of tasks about probing questions or those type of office hours to get people together and get them conversing.
Yeah, that's everything. It's so interesting because I think a lot of people are really struggling with this point. So I love that the
Yeah.
office hours, I think that's really helpful. And I think what really happens with product marketing, kind of streamlining conversation and communication always happens kind of like in the margins, right? Like you said at the water cooler or like having a conversation with a product manager during lunch. I've been actually remote for a couple of years, so it's been really interesting just to see how to navigate that. But I think creating personal connections and relationships is always super helpful because then people really tell you what they're thinking as opposed to giving you an answer, right? Like there's so much more context when there's a relationship. So, yeah, thank you for that. So,
No
Robert,
worries.
thank you so much for your time, Robert. I'm super grateful to have you on the show, especially with the time difference. For those of you who don't know, Robert's actually in Dublin, I believe.
That's correct. Yes. Sunny Dublin.
Sunny Dublin. So you can stay tuned for upcoming shows with product marketing leaders from startups to public companies as they share some of their best tips and strategies on the go-to-market process. And send us a note. Tell us what you learned. You could tag me, tag Robert, tag LinkedIn. And for those of you who are looking for more material on go-to-market, you can also check out my book, Product Marketing Debunked, on Amazon or one of my many articles on Medium. Thanks again.